Celebrating more than 20 years in the field of video communications, Jeremiah Films continues to lead the way as an effective creator of hard-hitting, life-changing motion pictures. Through its high standards of excellence, Jeremiah Films has impacted the world with its production and distribution of intelligent, innovative, and thought-provoking films, videos, books, and music. The founder and president of Jeremiah Films is award-winning motion picture producer Patrick Matriciana, whose work has been praised by a number of well-known leaders from around the world.
So I would say to Pat Matriciana, you did the country a great service in producing those tapes.
As a result, Mr. Matriciana has become a much sought-after radio and television talk show guest. His wife, Jeremiah Films co-founder and creative director Carol Matriciana, is an internationally recognized cult expert, a best-selling author and researcher who has co-produced many of the organization's most successful titles. With its in-depth analysis of ancient and modern world religions, Jeremiah Films is at the forefront of providing authoritative, biblically based insight into a myriad of ever-expanding new religious movements. In addition to its meticulous research, Jeremiah Films has been the first to exclusively capture a number of secret religious rites and rituals on camera. These groundbreaking documentaries, filmed all over the world, feature leading experts whose skilled examinations provide a clear understanding into the often confusing and conflicting faiths which abound. We at Jeremiah Films invite you to join with us as we continue to educate and equip those who desire to know the truth concerning the many challenges facing our world. For a complete list of products, including new releases, visit our website at www.jeremiahfilms.com or write us at P.O. Box 1710, Hemet, California, 92546. To place an order, you can email us or call toll-free 1-800-828-2290.
I climb down a ladder. I just close my eyes and start visualizing myself climbing down a ladder, and when I get to the bottom rung, I sort of spiral backwards. I kind of just dive backwards, and then each circle gets bigger and bigger, a little slower and slower, and eventually I just kind of drift off, and the next thing I know, I open my eyes, and it could be 5 minutes or 5 hours later.
Whatever was coming through was a master, absolute master of manipulation. They or it knew something.
I allow it to occur, and I can feel the energy coming around me. It's sort of like, not like sticking your finger in a wall socket, but something less than that, and you feel it in you. You know it's present.
How do you know who you're talking to? That's one of the questions I ask these people. How can you really be sure of the identity of this entity? That ought to frighten you. Maybe they're misrepresenting themselves. They got no ID.
If you put their statements under a microscope, you'll find, especially the ones about past life, you find out that something is wrong here, that the picture is not complete.
Without a doubt, if it is for real, you'll be opening up doors that are meant to remain closed, just like I did, and eventually you'll have spirit entities controlling you.
They say that there's like not a lot of difference in some ways. Actually, they're talking to me about it right now.
It is called channeling, where the physical body is only the vehicle. The vocal cords resound with non-physical voices. The phenomenon is widespread. There are thousands of channelers in North America alone, and millions of adherents come from all walks of life, seeking the wisdom of the so-called spirit guides. Who are these voices? Extraterrestrials? Ascended masters? Highly evolved spirit beings? These are just some of their claims.
It will laugh. It will laugh.
The practice itself is difficult for any of us to accept at face value. Is the supernatural interacting with the natural? Are spirits really in contact with humans? If so, who are the voices making the claims and providing the information?
With the Edgar Cayce style, deep trance style, there came through a group of guides numbering in the thousands, several thousands, and in time they gave their name and they call themselves Starfleet.
They have told me that they are extraterrestrial intelligences from another star system, I guess is the closest thing you could say, and yet they're also multidimensional beings. Even though they do have physical forms, they're not quite the same as ours are. And there are others too that I've seen that are extraterrestrial, that look different from them, but they seem to work together.
Another channeler, Pat Radagast, channels a spirit called Emmanuel. In her book simply called Emmanuel's Book, Radagast describes her first encounter. The first time I saw Emmanuel, he appeared, as he still does, as a being of golden light. Steve White channels a group of entities who take on yet a different form.
I channel several different beings. There are beings that are termed the spiritual hierarchy and the Ashtar Command. All of a sudden everybody goes, ooh, the Ashtar Command, UFOs and stuff. But the Ashtar Command, they're etheric beings. They're not in a physical embodiment like we have. And as one evolves from, let's say, the third dimensional plane to others, they can choose different aspects of service. And the Ashtar Command are ascended masters who have chosen to be in service to different planets going through transition.
Ageron's about 8 feet tall. He's slim, but very powerful. His main emanation seems to be in the blue range, the blues, the violets, the purples. Actually, I called him Blue for many years because I couldn't hear his name. Even Ageron is only a very small portion of his real name, because their names are comprised of all their experience and all their knowledge, and we just don't have the vocal cords or the comprehension to be able to say their whole name. So they've given me little bits of their names.
The expertless experts.
Jacques Purcell is internationally renowned. He channels Lazarus, a non-physical entity whose teachings have influenced the lives of thousands of people through public lectures, video and audio tapes, and personal consultation.
Who is he? That's a good question. He's never been physical, and he's never had a body form. That disturbs some people because they assume because I'm physical and because you're physical, everybody in the universe has been physical and have all been here on Earth or whatever. We're starting to accept the idea that maybe there are life forms that are other than on Earth, and maybe eventually we can accept the idea that there are life forms that don't have bodies either. And he's one of those. He refers to himself as a consciousness, an intelligence, a spark of love, a spark of light without form. And that's probably the best description of what he is. Who he is just this incredible loving energy that seems to be here to not save us and not do for us, but to befriend us and help us do for ourselves. It's nothing mysterious. I don't know if it would work for everybody, but it seems to work for me, and that is I climb down a ladder. I just close my eyes and start visualizing myself climbing down a ladder, and when I get to the bottom rung, I sort of spiral backwards. I kind of just dive backwards, and then each circle gets bigger and bigger, a little slower and slower, and eventually I just kind of drift off, and the next thing I know, I open my eyes, and it could be 5 minutes or 5 hours later, and I know something must have happened because I always feel good afterwards. So that's how I do it, and yeah, I've done it now for as many as 10 or 12 times a day for once a day at least for 13 years now.
I relax, and I developed my own relaxation technique, which everyone would find for themselves to be unique. I relax. I raise my vibrational frequency by bringing my thoughts to thankfulness and joy and love and such higher thought form frequencies, as well as I visualize moving into a lighter and more refined vibration of existence. So I imagine light and refined feeling. And from there, I connect with my source, and this source I allow to blend with my energy. Of course, I'm familiar with this source, and I feel like I fill up with golden light. I feel like I'm filling up with golden light, and it's grounded right down to my feet, and they just start speaking from there. They speak through me. I step aside, and because I step aside, that is why I go into a trance state.
I just step aside. I just get out of the way. And it's possible that like a main portion of my energy body steps aside, leaving the portion that keeps the heart going and the lungs going and everything there. And then that part of Ageron, or whoever is speaking, will come in and utilize my form.
That area of the spiritual realm that reach down to humankind, call them angelic being, extraterrestrials, whatever, that reach down, they are available for us to channel from, to reach, to help guide our lives, to help us make this a better place so that we are more about the divine plan down here, the plan that was originally brought into being when life was brought about. And you can reach that realm and be guided to them by meditating.
There was a natural talent who didn't really know anything about me except I was a psychic. She doesn't know anything about channeling. She doesn't know from extraterrestrials. And at some point, we were kind of like doing a meditation together. And suddenly she looked at me and she said, "You seem to have a veil all around you." And she continued looking. She says, "No, it's not a veil. It's like a shower of light." And she starts looking up and she goes, "Oh my God." I say, "What do you see?" She proceeded to describe the three to me. Says it's like they're in some sort of spaceship, but of course it's not a spaceship. She didn't want to, I'm sure, appear that she was like seeing things. And she says there's these three beings. Each of them have a different thing they're supposed to do, but they do it together. And she's just looking up. And she says, and they seem to be different colors. Now, she didn't know anything about this, about me.
In Hungry Ghosts, investigative journalist Joe Fisher examines the phenomenon of channeling and the spirit world. He discusses the origins.
Well, the earliest recorded information that we have is really with the ancient Greeks and the Greek oracles, when priestesses would be dressed in white and would go into a trance and bring through voices and prophecies to the assembled gathering. Channeling has been known by a number of different names in different cultures over the centuries. But it next rears its head in a major way with the Victorians in the last century.
Alexander Blair Ewart, editor of Dimensions magazine, has studied the resurgence of channeling and its pagan beginnings.
Trance-channeling basically emerged in the mid-1800s when science had destroyed Western religion, essentially. Something that had been repressed for about 2,000 years, which was paganism, and earlier atavistic forms of religion came gushing to the surface. So suddenly you had this pagan approach to the spirit that had been repressed for a couple of thousand years, and it suddenly floated to the surface.
When mediums would sit in a seance and sit among people who came into this seance room to listen to the words of the entities who were speaking through the medium. And these entities were often Chinese and Red Indian guides. Why they prevailed, we don't know, but often the guides who spoke through, and I use the word guides in quotes, the entities who came through were often Red Indian and Chinese, and would make pronouncements about the lives of the sitters in that room, would tell them much about themselves, would be able to speak clairvoyantly about the people who are gathered around the medium. And the medium would be insensible, would be often sitting back with their eyes closed, and would just pronounce in a monotone voices. And the voices would often change as different entities would come through.
It seems that mostly people are using channeling at this stage in less of a 19th century way, where you went to get a message from your Auntie Mary who'd, passed over 10 years ago, and where the messages were very much in terms of the medium coming through and saying, I've got your Auntie Mary here and here's some advice. Now people seem to be drawing on channeling from the point of view of saying, which is why ultimately I don't think channeling is dangerous, because the way that the individual interacts with it is, and I've done a lot of research, talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, they tend to say, well, I get this kind of information from the channeled entity. I take from it what I want to use. I take from it what I feel comfortable with, and I try to develop myself spiritually through that.
I think that channeling is part of the end result of the me generation. It's people looking to see how much they can personalize themselves, how much they can get into their own things, how much they can, get their own goodies, and here's another goodie they can get. But that's only a small part of it. I think a larger part of it is that you're finding in our society today a tremendous fear and anxiety and a need for some kind of authority which will give people direction.
What has drawn me to channeling is that in religious structures, they're precisely that, they're a structure. And if you're looking for a sense of security and conformity, then you go and you find their answers. But channeling is a way that helps you find your own answers. And it makes your life far more meaningful. You're not dependent on someone to tell you who you are, what you should do.
We are a culture which is now what I would call rejecting many of the assumptions that we've lived with for the past 300 years. For example, the assumption that the rational is the only way of knowing truth. And so you have that being in some ways pushed aside, and people saying, no, that there are many other ways of finding truth. And one of those ways of finding truth is to connect with another reality, a spirit reality or a spiritual reality. And so there's a searching after that.
Traditional religion never did it for me. External authority never did it for me. I always felt there was something inside there that needed to come up to the surface. So I studied altered states of consciousness. One day a friend was leading me through a meditation, and I sensed an energy in the room. And to make a long story short, the energy was very loving, very benevolent, and I got a sense that it wanted to drop in to my body.
And this is really an introduction of what we would call a neo-paganism. It's a reintroduction into the West of beliefs that have been around for thousands upon thousands of years, that there are in fact spiritual entities and spiritual realities both in nature and outside of nature, and we can contact them. So I think all of that comes together at a time when people are very insecure, they're searching for direction, they want answers, they want certainty, but they feel all the old ways of giving answers are not appropriate. And so there are certain groups of people who are now wanting to tune in to spirits that can give them help and can give them direction.
Joe Fisher had researched metaphysics for many years before encountering the world of channeling. In his book, Fisher tells how he was invited to the home of a woman he calls Aviva, who claimed that there were entities from another dimension speaking through her. A small group of people gathered weekly to witness the various voices who would take control of Aviva.
I was so impressed with the accents, the personalities, the different languages that were produced by Aviva in her trance state, that I said to my friends, and among them several journalists, you've got to see this. You've got to come to this house and witness this for yourself, which they did. And the group, by me introducing people, by these other people also introducing other people, the group swelled to close to 30 at its peak.
He phoned up and said, I've found this group that meets on Friday night, and it's just great, and you've got to come and see what's happening. And I think the intimation was that this was almost a secret society.
And so you can imagine there was Aviva lying down on her Chesterfield with her little pink slippers pointed towards the ceiling, going into trance, and she would switch from one voice to another, that is different guide, so-called guide, speaking through her, as each different person in the room would speak, and they would go around the room different, and they would never introduce themselves. A voice would come out, and immediately the voice that she was producing would change in accordance with the voice that asked the question.
And all of these entities, these beings, were what we would call inside of her physical body. We would see a lot of changes that would take over. It wasn't just the voices, but in being relatively close to her as these beings were coming through, I could see the difference. I could see the characteristics of these entities as they came through. Her body and particularly her face would change.
Her eyes were closed. She couldn't see this. It was all done. I don't know how it was done. To this day, I have many questions about just what was going on. But all I know is that Laurence Olivier, on his finest day at the Old Vic, could never have produced this array of different inflections and voices and languages within a space of an hour.
Each one of us had a major guide. Like Russell was her guide, and Tuktu was mine.
And I spoke to the entity that came forward, Russell Parnick, and he described himself as a sheep farmer from the last century. That was his last incarnation. And he proceeded to tell me that I had a guide too who was looking after me on the earthbound plane, or rather, the guide was in the disembodied realm. And her name was Philippa, she was Greek, that her and I had been together in Greece in the 18th century, and it was now her responsibility in this other realm to oversee my spiritual development while I was on Earth.
Fisher was intrigued by the entity claiming to be Philippa, his spirit guide. While it was speaking through Aviva, he taped the voice and took it to a linguistic specialist at the University of Toronto to verify its authenticity.
This man's name is Dr. George Thaniel, and he's a native-born Greek himself. So I thought the perfect, the linguistics professor who is a Greek by birth. He listened to 2 tapes of Philippa speaking, and he said, in part, this is a native-born Greek woman speaking. So I thought, well, there is proof that Aviva is not concocting this. She hasn't just been to the library, read some Greek, and then is making it up for me. And even if she were to learn Greek, she would be unable to speak with the voice of a native-born Greek.
With such impressive evidence, Fisher embarked on a journey to validate the claims of the guides. Had they lived previous lives?
Joe's involvement and that became quite enhanced. He had decided at that point that this was something unique and marvelous, and that he was going to write a book on channeling and bring out all of this wonderful information that we were given, and actually go and source these various entities. I mean, you have to realize that there was 25 or 30 people in this time had been involved, and each one of them had guides, and each one of these guides had lifetimes and backgrounds, and he was going to find proof of Russell's existence and proof of his guide's existence, and that was going to be part of the book, and that was going to substantiate this wonderful information.
Fisher's first trip took him to England, where Aviva's spirit guide, Russell Parnick, claimed to have lived as an 18th century sheep farmer.
He spoke about living near the village of Heathfield in Yorkshire, and the village, I visited it. It was there just as he had described, just a few houses and a little church, this sort of thing. And Russell spoke about the Druids' stones nearby, which were half a day's ride away on horseback, touchingly evoked in last century language, and that was there just as he said. He said he had a 22-acre farm. I wasn't able to find the farm, but he said that the farm abutted onto the Burn Gill, which was a little stream that ran into the larger Nidderdale River, and the stream and the river were there. However, when I came to the litmus test again of finding Russell Parnick, I searched high and low in the records, in the church records, in the government records. He was nowhere to be found.
Another guide, Ernest, claimed to have been a bomber pilot with the Royal Air Force in 99 Squadron in World War II. Once again, Fisher went to great lengths to prove this claim, even interviewing surviving members of the squadron, only to leave disappointed.
Now, most of the historical and geographical information he had provided was accurate, was there. There's only one problem. Ernest, the bomber pilot, did not exist. I couldn't find him in the records. So I came back to Toronto, and I told him I was much impressed with the fact that all this information was there. There was just this one problem, that I couldn't find him. Then he went into a great song and dance about karma, how he has a charge sitting in his room who he must look after. And he had realized too late that the information he was giving me might be detrimental to the welfare of his charge who's on the earthbound plane, and he had decided, he said, to change the information, to backtrack. Now, I argued with him at great length. I said, you could have told me this before I left if you'd felt this. And even so, you started off by giving me your name before you had this change of mind, and the name that I was looking for was just not in the records. And he weaseled and whined and invoked the higher laws. So he got out of it. But the question remained with me. Was Ernest telling the truth? Was he not? I will have to check out other guides to find out whether this is true or not.
The obvious choice of guides to investigate was his own Philippa, whom he had come to trust as a result of his personal effort to make contact.
You see, initially, Philippa encouraged me to contact her, and that she said that rather than just go through a medium, the best way to contact your guide was directly. And she said that if I concentrated on her every day for 15 minutes or more, that I would be able to make this contact after a period of time. And so every morning I would go up to my study and I would train myself, my mind, on making contact with her. Nothing happened for weeks and weeks and weeks, but eventually an image of a woman walking towards me in a white wrap was presented to my inner vision. And I was convinced that this was Philippa, and my response was to weep, and I cried for several minutes. And again, when I went back to the group, Philippa, I didn't have to say anything. Philippa said, you see, we have made contact. And again, this is another one of the bricks in the wall.
So he said, well, yeah, he was going to go off, and his guide, who loved him dearly and certainly would not deceive him, had given him all this information, and he had maps and research, and he was going to go and find her. He couldn't find Russell. You know, the entity known as Russell had never been born in that parish or lived in that place, but enough of it fitted. I mean, he knew the general area, same as Ernest knew about World War II bombers and things like that. But Joe knew that he could never be deceived by his guide.
Now, I then went to Greece looking for Philippa, and a similar thing happened. I was looking for the village of Theros, which she had said was only 5 days' walk away from the Black Sea, again touchingly evoked in the old ancient language, which made me believe her initially. I went to the town of Alexandroupolis in northeastern Greece, and it was there that the edifice on which her testimony was based on, which was already crumbling because of the failure of her colleagues to pan out. I had expected Alexandroupolis to be an ancient city based on Alexander the Great, and when I went there, I found that it wasn't, and that in fact that Alexandroupolis was only built, I think it was at the beginning of this century, at the end of the last century, and Philippa was talking about it having existed in her day, and this could not have been. So I carried on my search there, looking for more clues to her existence. But Philippa, even though her Greek had been veridical, Philippa too went the same way. And it was a wrenching disillusionment for me.
Mike Mandel is a Canadian entertainer and lecturer. For many years, he was involved in various aspects of the occult, including spirit mediumship. Dozens of entities would speak through him on an ongoing basis.
I became involved in what is now known as channeling in the late 1960s. It was a spontaneous experience. We had been trying astral travel and a group of other techniques to let our spirits leave our bodies, to develop clairvoyant abilities, and so on. And when I say we, I mean a small group of us that had polarized together around an occult worldview. By trying these different techniques, I inadvertently opened myself up, and various entities began speaking through me. Initially speaking in my head, and then eventually taking over to such a degree they were using my vocal cords and speaking through me to our friends.
Mike could literally be talking to you as I'm talking to you now, and instantly, in a moment, change and be taken over, and someone else would be talking. And his voice would literally stop being Mike and all of a sudden be somebody else.
Initially, it seemed to take them quite a bit of effort to take control of me. And it was more or less a voluntary thing. But as time passed, I realized that it was getting much, much easier for them to slip in and out. We used to call it someone popping in. We'd say, oh, so-and-so just popped in when you were gone. And they would appear sometimes for hours, sometimes for just a few minutes. And then we realized eventually that they were able to go in and out as they pleased by the end of things. And we asked one of the entities, someone asked on my behalf and said, why is it that you can get in and out of Mike's personality so readily? And they said something to the effect of, all human beings have a door that will keep other spirit beings out. And in most people's cases, the door is locked and barred and stapled shut and roped shut and sealed. And they said in my case, it was virtually hanging off the hinges.
They claimed to be distinctive entities. In other words, if they had a name, they would say their name. If they had a purpose or a distinctive, they would tell you that in many cases. But the range would range from very what we call low-level life forms that really didn't seem to have any purpose except to be pranksters, that sort of thing, on up to through the sort of human range, right on up to the what you call ascended masters, the wise, benevolent, powerful type entities, and the antithesis of that, the evil, powerful, intelligent entities as well.
They claim to be ascended masters, highly advanced spirit beings, even on other planets, people on various astral planes who had reincarnated and then gone on to perfection, Tibetan Buddhists, people from the past. I mean, there was an entire realm of things that they called themselves. However, the common thread was they were all spiritually pure and were contacting our little group specifically to help us evolve spiritually.
Warder often witnessed strange occurrences. He feared the darker controlling entities, one of whom regularly threatened him with knives. Still, he was fascinated by the spirit's powers.
One evening when I was over at Mike's place, we were just sitting talking when all of a sudden one of the entities popped in and became visibly angry with, I think, primarily myself, and began ranting and raving. I can't remember the exact words he was saying, but he got up and sort of stormed off into the kitchen. My habit being to always follow Mike into the kitchen or anywhere where there were knives present. And so I just followed, but I was very concerned with what was going on. As I got to the doorway of the kitchen, Mike, quote, Mike was standing and had picked up 2 Coke bottles off the counter, 2 26-ounce Coke bottles, and held them both out in front of him and crushed them simultaneously, one in each hand. Then, unfortunately, Mike, the entity left, and Mike was not able to come back right away. And in that delay time, Mike fell forward into the broken glass, cutting his, I don't know if his hands were cut at that moment or when he actually crushed the bottles, but they were cut fairly badly. He was obviously in shock when he came back. I got him up, moved him to the couch in the living room, and again he was taken over, this time by another entity which seemed much gentler, more benevolent, and held out his hands in a very almost pathetic sort of way and said, "Do the wounds on my hands seem familiar to you?" And now we had an entity who was claiming to be or imitating Christ.
One of the things the entities used to do was they used to test us. It was as though we were being brainwashed. We'd be told to do something very bizarre immediately, or we'd be told to go at midnight to this certain forest that was very, very terrifying to us because there'd been a number of manifestations there. We'd be told to go alone there at midnight and stay there for an hour and then come home. And they were testing our readiness to respond immediately to their commands. And we were not to test them ever, because they always said proof comes to those who do not ask for it, which sounds vaguely biblical, but it isn't. And I recall one time, one of the entities was put to the test. One of the particular people in the group suddenly spoke to it in German. And the entity, without missing a beat, stopped its sentence with the other person, turned and addressed him in flawless German, and then turned back and continued the conversation. Well, none of us knew German. None of us had studied it at any time. But the entity was able to switch in and out of the other language immediately.
This was something that nobody was supposed to know, and we couldn't tell anybody at all. But the big thing was she was dying of leukemia, and that, and as this remarkable coincidence, the hand of fate, the intervention of God in the universe, I was the only person that could help her, and if I didn't do this, she was going to die.
The guides told him that he was the only member of the group who had healing powers that could be used to help Aviva recover from her leukemia. They brought him in, they brought him closer to Aviva. They then advised the previous hypnotist that his time was up and that Sanford should be looking after her in her trance state, and that Sanford could do the healing, and that's why he should become the leader of the group. So this is what happened, and Sanford, in giving the healing, being instructed by the guides to place his hands on Aviva's body, and he would feel through his fingers great sensations of cold or heat, depending on the instructions the guides were giving him.
I could actually feel these energies flowing, and feel the results of them, and it would take a long time to describe, but there were many different physical manifestations of this.
If Aviva had a serious pain problem with her leukemia, she would call Sanford. He'd come rushing down, talk her into trance, administer the healing, bring her back, and then he would talk to Russell, the main guide, and Russell would say, "Great job, Sanford. Without you, we couldn't carry on."
What was actually happening was that I was suffering some real physical and mental and emotional problems because of all of the, not only demands, but also because of all this energy that was going through. And only after the fact, when I broke clean and got away from it, did I realize that they were doing it. They were creating this dependency. I would have to go and not only heal her, but put her down and ask them, being Russell and Tuck too, who was supposedly my guide, to channel energies through me to sort of balance my energies or fix me, because I was getting right weird. These strange energies were flowing through me, and I was having hallucinations and all kinds of physical problems. And geez, these guys were really great. About 10 minutes with them, flowing energy through me, and I was fine. I was like an addict that just had a hit. I was great. I just fell on top of the world. It was only afterwards I realized they were doing it. They were creating it. They were creating a dependency.
And so he found that he was like a psychic drug addict. He would be going to Aviva not only to help her restore her health, but in fact to pump up his own flagging energies. And it was only when he pulled away that he began to realize, hey, I feel better. And he said he realized that he felt better because he was no longer under their sphere of influence.
Sanford Allison went into channeling with no background training in metaphysics or meditation or in the use of higher mind or in the use of discrimination. It appears that the entity was well aware of that.
But Sanford Ellison did not lack training. As a practicing psychic, he had much experience in the realm of metaphysics. However, this training did not prove to be a safeguard.
I was really what you would call over the edge. I was not rational throughout that time, and it got to that point. I was totally dependent on them, whoever they were, And outside of that, I was just subject to illusions and delusions and forces that I had no understanding of.
Famous mystic Emanuel Swedenborg spent an entire lifetime associating with the spirit world, yet he warned, when the spirits begin to speak with a man, he ought to beware that he believes nothing whatever from them, for they say almost anything. Things are fabricated by them, and they lie. They would tell so many lies, and indeed with solemn affirmation, that a man would be astonished. If a man listens and believes, they press on, and deceive and seduce in many ways.
I don't know what Ekton is. That's why I call him a non-physical personality. In my own meditations, I've met some personalities that are a little shady, you know, but nothing that I would consider demonic in a traditional religious sense.
The problem with mediumship is, perhaps the greatest common denominator, is it's very unnatural for people to turn over their personal sovereignty to another entity. When they do this, they don't know what they're picking up. They don't know who's speaking through them. There's no way that they can test what this voice is, what its source is. And as I've said, that usually, perhaps 99% of the time, if not more, that voice is there as a parasite, no more.
Author Dave Hunt, in his book America, The Sorcerer's New Apprentice, examines channeling.
Carl Jung, in his time, he said, no, these are depths of the psyche, but he came to believe that these are spirit beings. You can't escape it before his death. And he came to believe maybe they may not all be good. Maybe some of them are evil. So there are people who would say it's the wisdom of the universe, the ancient wisdom. Edgar Mitchell, one of our astronauts, at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which he founded, he would say that sort of thing. It's the ancient wisdom that, when you were back in Greek days, they consulted the oracle at Delphi. And there's some kind of a mysterious wisdom that's just built into our genes, into the collective consciousness or psyche of the human race. Others would say, no, these are ascended masters. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who claims to channel Jesus and Buddha and so forth, she would say that. Others would say it used to be popular to say these are the spirits of the dead. There are a variety of explanations for this. My research indicates they're demons.
While researching mediumship, Western psychologist William James stated, "The refusal of modern enlightenment to treat possession as a hypothesis to be spoken of as even possible, in spite of the massive human experience in its favor, has always seemed to me a curious example of the power of fashion in things scientific." That the demon theory will have its innings again is to my mind absolutely certain. One has to be scientific indeed to be blind and ignorant enough to suspect no such possibility.
Well, they claim to be ascended masters, but in reality, they were the exact opposite end of the spiritual scale. There's no question in my mind now that they were demon spirits. If you had asked me then, I would have believed entirely that they were higher beings, a higher spiritual order of beings. I wouldn't have believed in demons. I didn't think they existed. I thought they were an invention of the Christian church. In retrospect now, I can see back with horrible clarity that they were malevolent, created, demonic spirits intent on our destruction.
Some of these entities out here will say, oh yeah, they're bad spirits, and they're good spirits. In fact, the old mediums, before the channelers came along, it was a little more complicated. And the mediums would have a control. It was called a control spirit. And the function of the control spirit was to keep the bad spirits away, and to kind of line things up, and make it work out as it should. And they would even say, oh, that was a lower entity.
In my own case, I recall that some of the entities we had to deal with were overtly violent, almost psychotic. And the others were pure and altruistic, and all they wanted to do was help us, and they would warn us about things that the nasty entities were doing, and they would give us teaching and methods of developing ourselves and so on. In retrospect, I'd like to say that all the entities were equally evil. It was the clever way it was presented by showing this group as overtly evil that made us more ready to accept these guys as the good guys. In reality, they were all in it together.
In evaluating the situation, the reason they appeared to be good or evil was to create a contrast and also to create further deception. You know, it was obviously that the whole thing was an incredible deception, but it would have had no credibility if it was obvious as a deception.
Obviously, what spirits do is warp people's perception of what reality is about. And I think one of the difficult things is that you are really dealing with people who are being duped, is the best word I could say, and in that handing over of themselves to this power, in that handing over, they're going to see that as good stuff and not see that they are moving towards some very destructive things for themselves and for others.
Biblical writers of both Old and New Testament have much to say about the continuous attempt by Satan and evil spirits or demons to deceive the human race. Moses wrote of Satan's enticement and deception of Eve in the Garden of Eden, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God." Ramtha, channeled by J.Z. Knight, has stated, "What is termed God is within your being, and that which is called Christ is within your being. And when you know you are God, you will find joy." Helen Schuckman, who claims to channel Jesus, states in her work entitled A Course in Miracles, "God's name is holy, but no holier than yours. To call upon his name is but to call upon your own. You are the Holy Son of God himself."
Helen Schuckman, who was a psychologist at Columbia University, and kept hearing this voice that said, "This is a Course in Miracles, take it down. This is a Course in Miracles, take it down." She didn't want to take it down. She was an atheist. She didn't believe in this other dimension. And she consulted her fellow psychologists, and they said, "Well, go ahead." And so she took it down, 1,100 pages, A Course in Miracles, which claimed to come from Jesus, but which, in fact, undermined everything Jesus said.
It's the age-old battle between good and evil. The Bible will tell you that the devil will come in many forms. And in a sense, these beings are an aspect of that side of nature, the dark side. And therefore, they don't like mention of Christ. They won't come out usually and say Christ is bad. They will subtly put Christ down. They will say that Christ wasn't really a truly historic figure, that his deeds have been magnified over the years.
All people who are channeling entities, whatever they say they are, Jesus Christ, Buddha, your Aunt Vera, whoever, they're not these pure, altruistic, beautiful beings that they seem to be. If you strip away the covering, you'll find a demon behind every one of these voices, behind every one of the spirits. In fact, one of their most clever ploys is to appear, as the Bible says, even Satan disguises as an angel of light. We're seeing these emissaries of evil that are dressing in the most wonderful packaging, so people are accepting them as genuine. People are seeing them as good and pure. And in reality, even the good ones are demon spirits.
Very clever and subtle manipulation.
St. Paul wrote, "Some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons." Proponents of channeling claim the identity of the spirits is unimportant. Information is all that matters. Truth is subjective. If it sounds right, accept it. Biblical writers warn that these unseen entities are in fact evil spirits, and the people who succumb to their teachings are ultimately deceived. Who are the voices behind this phenomenon? Who goes there?